never been comfortable at any job that I've ever been at either.
I'm sorry, I forgot what I was like.
Love's really important to me, but I never felt like I ever really loved anyone in a way that wasn't partly a reflection of my own needs or desires.
Okay, Yara, I'm happy for you and I'm gonna let you finish, but isn't this a bit of an overreaction to accidentally burning some vegetables? Right, Even the Ocean. Well, if you know me, you'll know that I've been a really strong supporter of this game for quite a while, even while it was still in development. Now, I'll be the first to admit that it does have its flaws, but overall, for a game made almost entirely by 2 people, I'd say they did a pretty remarkable job personally. So, at a quick glance, what's the deal with this game? Well, it was created by Johnny Kitaka and Sean Hantani Chen Hogan, known collectively, on and off, as Analgesic Productions, named after their previous game Anodyne, which is equally amazing, but time and a place. Even the Ocean was released on Steam and a handful of other PC-bound platforms on the 16th of November 2016. And yes, if I may break the fourth wall for a moment, I am British, so I'm going to format any dates that I display in these videos Britishly. Live with it. One fun little fact about this one is that it started life as 2 separate games, Even and The Ocean. I, for one, wouldn't have thought that, bearing in mind how nicely the full title rolls off the tongue, but that's the story apparently. It spent a good 3.5 years in development in various forms, and for a 2-person development team, that's pretty speedy, especially considering the game is capable of running at a cool 60 frames per second should you want it to. In fact, it has a fair few features built in to make life easier for the modern gamer, including settings that make the game more conducive to speedrunning, optimization settings to suit your computer's graphics capabilities, and even a setting to tweak some of the harder parts of the game to be, well, a bit more forgiving. In conventional terms, that means making the platforming a bit easier and the damage you take a bit more forgiving, but this isn't a conventional game. How can I explain this? Well, all good games start off as an idea, or a design ethos, if you want unofficial, official-sounding terminology. In the case of Even the Ocean, that ethos is a heavily story-driven 2D puzzle platformer that distinctly doesn't have a health bar. Does that mean you're just this invincible tank of a protagonist who can survive anything? Well, no. And the way that's tied into the game's core mechanics works beautifully. In Even the Ocean, instead of your standard health bar, you have a balance bar of sorts at the bottom of the screen, which is separated into 4 chunks, and filled on one side with green or light energy, and on the other with purple or dark energy. The closer you are to being fully balanced, the closer you are to what would be full health in any other game. But there is some motivation to shifting that balance. As is an integral part of the game's story and world, light energy represents verticality, and dark energy horizontality, if that's a word. So the more light energy you have, the higher you jump, but the slower you move. And if you have more dark energy, you can run faster, but you can't jump as high. And if you get too much of one type of energy, you die on the spot. I mean, can you imagine being so full of vertical energy that the very cells of your body can no longer move on a horizontal plane? Or something equally horrifying, but that's vice versa? Eugh. And that's all very nicely worked into the story of the game. The protagonist is a woman by the name of Aleph, or, well, she might be non-binary, it's never officially stated that she isn't. Anyway, she works for the government of Whiteforge City, this grand futuristic city that functions as the country's capital, and she has to go to the various outlying towns and areas and satellite township whatevers and check on their power plants, which take the world's energies and convert them into power, electricity, whatever you may need, and naturally that's where all the platforming shenanigans come into play. Before too long, these large creatures known as geomes emerge and start to threaten the power plants and Whiteforge City itself, and so Aleph works with the government to delve into their continent's history to try and find a way to combat them and protect their homeland. I won't spoil too much about how that goes, but it does involve a lot of platforming. And so Aleph, with her energy-reflecting shield and uncanny capacity to wall jump up even a single vertical surface, sets off to these various wild and gorgeously hand-painted looking locations to do just that. So, once you've got your head around how the energies work, it's a fairly simple setup. So what is it about this game that I like so much? Well, where to begin? I mean, for one, there's what I just talked about, not just the ingenious concept, but also how it's woven so naturally into the game's world. Throughout the game, Aleph runs into these little bits and pieces that remind you this whole world revolves around differing balances of light and dark energy. You get to see how this influences people's lives, the natural world, architecture, the way culture has grown around it, and occasionally what happens when it goes wrong. So, as if that whole thing isn't already a beautiful allegory for the concept of balance, yin and yang and all that, it also works very well as a raw game mechanic. It's not just a question of simple stuff like, oh, can I make this jump? Would I be able to make this jump if I shifted my energy balance? There's also more than a copious helping of other applications to it as well, including riding beams of concentrated energy, reflecting bullets of energy so that they charge up doors and open them, or transferring amounts of it from a source to a switch, whether that's by making up the difference from your own energy reserves, or carrying it in a fragile bubble that pops if you don't platform carefully enough, or that sort of thing. And each main area ends with a platforming challenge involving carrying these metal poles, some horizontal and some vertical, through some hazards and to a receptacle, making sure the crystal lens that moves back and forth along it doesn't hit any sources of energy along the way. Again, not only does that give a sense of closure to each area, it also serves as a reminder that every area has its purpose, and that Aleph, in playing the game, is doing her job as a repairs technician to make sure that each power plant is tuned up. There is also the narrative itself, which works just as beautifully in isolation from the actual gameplay. As well as the overarching plot of Aleph, Whiteforge, and the impending threat of the Geomes, there's also a much smaller, much more personal story about Aleph finding her way in the big city and finding her niche in its society, ultimately befriending Yara, who was, as far as we can tell, the love interest of Aleph's former mentor Cassidy prior to, spoiler alert, her death in the prologue of the game. Everything that goes on in the story on a macro level has ripple effects on Aleph's home life, for want of a better expression. Sometimes, Yara is there for emotional support. Sometimes their relationship becomes strained from the stress and the nature of the work Aleph has to undertake, while Yara continues to BoJack Horseman her way into a state of depression. Later on, a highly unusual individual by the name of Hummus arrives in the city, from somewhere decidedly foreign to Whiteforge, it's never really specified. As the Geomes start to cause trouble, the citizens quickly turn against them. That's right, them. Hummus is demonstrably non-binary. In a display of xenophobia that runs chillingly parallel to one episode of the classic Twilight Zone series, entitled The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and the title of that tells more than you might realise at first glance, so I shan't spoil any of that for you here, but there are some comparisons that came to mind immediately, or, well, for me at least. I'm a gentleman of culture. Anyway, Yara takes Hummus under her wing, which complicates matters further as the people of Whiteforge lose their patience with them, and as Aleph has to travel further and further at a time for each assignment. I'd say it all works out in the end, but, well, I won't spoil the specifics of that for you anyway, don't worry about it, just cross that bridge when you come to it. So the game's great in concept, but how does it hold up in the more superficial department? Well, see for yourself. The game is utterly gorgeous, and that's without the buttery fluidity of the game running at a full 60 FPS. I've let's played it and streamed it at 30 FPS, and it still looks amazing, incidentally, but that's not my focus here. As you can see with all the footage that I've unceremoniously shoved into this review, the game evokes a style reminiscent of the 16-bit era of graphics without actually being stuck to those limitations for really. And the things they've done with that freedom of not actually being 16-bit but just looking it, the things they've done with that are really incredible. Take, for instance, the Oscar Basin region of the game, a mostly untouched biome of snow backlit by a beautiful sunrise. That's all pixel art! What? It's beautiful! And it doesn't stop at the backgrounds either. The foreground elements that the player interacts with, the other characters, the story scenes, all of it, quite clearly put together with love and care, and it shows in no small way. One point that you might criticise the game for, though, is the character portraits in the dialogue boxes. I, for one, will defend them, bearing in mind that the game is almost going for reverse escapism in some parts of its story, as in, there's this fantastical, super advanced society with amazing technology and whatnot, but they still have to deal with the drudgery of daily life, and from that angle, it makes sense that the character portraits are a little grittier, a little rough around the edges, and a little, well, some people might say uglier, but that's almost the point. The pixel art itself is marvellous, and I believe the whole idea with the characters is they're not supposed to be these media-trained, makeup-departmented supermodels. They're supposed to be real people in real enough situations. They're there to be themselves, not to be aesthetically beautiful in the most superficial sense just to please a reviewer. But before I fly off on too much of a tangent here, I would also like to bring up the other aspect of the game's exterior, the music. Once again composed by Sean Hantedi Chen Hogan, as with Anodyne, the soundtrack, available on Steam and listed as DLC, and also on Sean's Bandcamp page, runs to about 6 hours long in total, including bonus tracks and whatnot, and every last track is sheer beauty. Every one of them, in some way or another, captures the essence of the area, the moment, or the character that they represent, as well as the general motif of uncertainty that the world of White Forge embodies. This idea that no matter how bleak the future seems, they must have developed past it. Right? And the general melancholy and loneliness of some of the areas, even if they have a local population, depending on what's going on in the story at that point. This idea of you don't have to be alone to be lonely, and vice versa. Overall, the soundtrack is every bit as mesmeric and dreamlike as Anodyne's, and in the best possible way. Even if the game doesn't look like your sort of thing to play, still give the soundtrack a fair go. You won't regret it, I promise. Now, there is one last point that I want to address as being one of this game's strongest points that not enough games or game developers seem to show, even in this day and age. It's not easy to convey with just footage in the background if you don't know what to look for and extract from what I'm showing. I'm talking about mindfulness. This game shows great strokes of consideration for not just its audience, but its potential audience, and the world at large as a whole as well, including people that may never even know this game exists, never mind play it. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't think I'll be able to cover absolutely everything in a timely manner, but first off, I've already mentioned that the game has a fair few options and settings that optimize the game for speedrunning. That is, you can set the text boxes to positively whiz by and replace any slow screen fades with instant cuts to black, and reduce the length of death animations and chapter intro screens, and more. Immediately, the game knows its audience. Secondly, the developers are very much aware that different people will want different things from the game, so there are 4 different options when you select New Game at the start. One is the full game, story, platforming, the works. A second is a chapter select kind of deal, but it's otherwise identical to the aforementioned, so immediately that's kind to Let's Players, and, well, casual players for that matter, should they lose their save data or whatever. It's the other 2 options that are what interest me the most though here. There's Story Mode and Gauntlet Mode. The game as a whole consists of a load of really well implemented platforming challenges and a really well written, plausibly written, emotional rollercoaster of a contemporary story. And these modes give you the opportunity to play just one of those 2 elements if you don't want the full experience of both. Just want a raw platforming challenge with all the levels back to back to back to back to back? Go Gauntlet Mode. Do you want just a visual novel with minor casual platforming elements every now and then to immerse you in the world? Story Mode is for you. And there are achievements based on progression in all 3 of the main modes. You can get an achievement for completing every chapter, whether it's in full story mode, Gauntlet Mode, or Story Mode. They're all separate. Nobody is left out. But I've been dancing around my real focus for a while now. My biggest praise, as far as awareness goes, is this game's approach to LGBTQ+ representation, and I do mean to use the extended abbreviation there. There's plenty of it. The whole idea of this game is to have a real-world level of representation, and it delivers above and beyond what you'd expect from even AAA titles out there. I've mentioned already that it isn't entirely certain whether or not the main protagonist is non-binary. Even if she isn't, there is some level of implied partnership with Yara, some sort of non-heteronormative relationship, and even if that isn't intended to signify romance, Yara was, prior to the events of the game, in a pretty well-defined relationship with Cassidy. Once again, not clear whether or not she was non-binary, but again, even if she wasn't, non-heteronormative relationship. Beyond that, other characters, both major and minor, come in all orientations, backgrounds, skin tones, identities, and everything. Alif's colleague Lopez and the mysterious Hummus both exist outside of the gender binary. The Boreas Heights area of the game prominently features a relationship between a pansexual man and a non-binary person, as well as their wheelchair-using housemate. There's a library out in the woods owned by a male librarian and his husband, and even in more general terms, the game features more than just the stereotypical old white men in positions of power routine. All of this is to say, Toby Fox, eat your heart out. I'm kidding, it's not a competition. Representation is good, and it should be applauded for moving the gaming industry forwards. So with all of this said, I think it's fair to award Even the Ocean a hearty rank B. What, after all that praise you were expecting a perfect A? I'm afraid not quite. I do have a slight qualm or two that slows my roll here. Make no mistake, I absolutely highly recommend this game because it's beautifully presented, painstakingly considerate, and just generally a wonderful experience. But I think the game is missing a huge trick by not having some kind of dedicated super hard mode. Even at its most difficult, it's still not that hard for me. It could be that its hardest is more of a moderate difficulty depending on your skill level, but overall, the tricks and puzzles that the game's world allows for with energy balancing and all of that are never really used to their fullest. For example, hypothetically, you could go through the entire game with your energy locked at perfect balance, so you don't get any speed or jump boosts, and you could still get through it, no worries. Sure, that does mean that it allows for a variety of playstyles, so if you don't want to shift your energy balance, you could still make it through, but for all intents and purposes, that means that it does still just end up working like a health bar for more of the time than it really should. At the very least, and this might be more of a wish list thing more than anything else, but I think it would benefit from some kind of level editor. It is an excellent game engine with a lot of potential, especially with the 2-energy system. I admit, I'd rather the whole experience be easy enough for beginners at the expense of not challenging veterans like me, so that it doesn't turn new players away, but, well, I guess there's an ironic allegory for finding balance in there somewhere. Overall, it is still an excellent game. Just that one gripe really, that there's a bit of missed potential overall, but Sean and Johnny make an excellent team, and they're definitely ones to keep an eye on over the next few years. I don't doubt their next couple of projects won't fail to impress, much like this, and Anodyne before it. Until then, or more accurately, until the next time you watch something of mine, I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons. Thank you so much for watching, and an especially hearty thank you and shout out to my Patreon supporters, who get to watch this review a whole month before it goes live to YouTube. If you haven't already, do go and at least check out patreon.com/TessHex. There are perks based on how much you pledge and everything, and that support is the whole reason why I make this series in the first place. You could even get a shout out from me right here and now in the video if you pledge the right amount. Anyway, I've said my piece, so I'll see you when next I see you. Until then.